Hi there, I'm Matt Springett, and I'm from an organization called Matt and Fiona. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization, which is an organization that was inspired, I guess, by two architects, myself and Fiona McDonald, my founding business partner. And our projects, I'm going to talk a little bit about the projects and where they came from, the route to the organization, and what it does. And then hopefully for those who are interested, spend a little bit more time dwelling on some projects in more detail, which will reveal the process. But as this slide suggests, all our projects start with this kind of question. Well, actually, everything we do starts with this question, which is how many young people look around them and feel they've had a say in what they see. And that might be a question that well, it definitely is a question we could ask of any adult. And we think it's really, really important, but particularly in the context of young people. And we are a small organization, hopefully doing bigger and bigger things, that thinks every young person and everyone should be empowered to have a say about their built environment, and ultimately for some people to be able to physically shape that. So a little bit about our journey. This is a picture of the completion day of our first project that was completed back in 2017, and was a project built and designed by young people between the ages of 8 and 14. Now, a little bit about Fiona and myself. I'll talk about the rest of the team and the organization a little bit more in a second. But Fiona and I are both architects by training. Fiona is a little bit younger than me, and I'm in my early 50s, but both had a training as architects, and I ran an architectural practice for many years and met Fiona, who, after her undergraduate studies in architecture, went to work for an organization called Open City and set up their learning program, which was an opportunity for young people to be exposed to architecture in the built environment, to do that through play. And we got to know each other through those activities. I was an architect that used to volunteer and work with her. And then I guess in sort of about 2014, 15, she was completing her master's, and she'd been working with a group of children in Japan, following a study trip there, to explore how, if you like, youth voice was being brought to the replanning of post-tsunami coastal Japan and the villages there, and how important it was to bring that youth voice, which is often about optimism and forward thinking, and often quite radical in its conception. She found processes of drawing and storytelling that enabled those young people to bring their ideas to the fore. And at the same time, I happened to be working, so we knew each other at this point, for an organization called Beam, initially, who just had a summer camp in New Hampshire, but also then grew into Beam Center in Brooklyn, New York, which I guess had an ambition of allowing young people to work with creative practitioners to realize creative visions that couldn't be built on their own. And in this case, we worked with a group of 8 to 18-year-olds to make this incredible timber contraption in the New Hampshire woods over a period of 3 weeks. That process and Fiona's process of sort of, I guess, pedagogy, we came back and we realized that we really needed to do something about that. And that first project that I showed was set up, a project, I guess, that the first one which I showed you, which was an opportunity for those young people to change the pace a little bit of their city. Now, 6 years further down the line, and with the slight hiatus that we've all had of COVID, and in the middle of that, we, as a small organization, have had an amazing impact. We've worked directly with over 4,500 young people. We've had the privilege of working with many incredible, talented volunteers, often local people, but also architects and engineers. And we've built over 37 buildings or installations of some scale, and I'll talk about some of these today. Out of the 4,500, 1,500 of those are in the last year alone, and we're experiencing a real exponential growth, both in terms of our reach, but also in the impact that we're doing. As I said, we're a small team. Historically, it was something that Fiona and I were doing as a side hustle, if you like, within our context of our other work. Fiona has always, whilst qualifying as an architect, has always worked in learning. So she set up learning programs for the Royal Institute of British Architects, and latterly, before we both gave our time full time to Matt and Fiona, was head of learning at the Design Museum in the UK. And I've always been involved in education and teaching. I teach at UCL Bartlett, and have run an architectural practice for many years, which I'm in the process of winding down to focus my time entirely on Matt and Fiona. And we're joined by a team of four other amazing young people who have inspiration and come to the table with the same mission to empower and bring skills to young people to let their voices be heard. And we've got John, Chloe, and George here, and they, historically, a lot of our partners and our team have been architects, and increasingly they come from a diversified background. And George from English and publishing, Chloe from graphics and curation, and so storytelling and how ideas are spread is a really important part, as well as physically manifesting what we do. So before we come through to some of the projects and processes which give more flavour to that, those projects that you'll see don't happen just with that team of 5. They happen with an amazing contribution of volunteers and participants, and perhaps most importantly, the young people themselves. Now, our work divides into what we would call 3 strands, maybe our strategy for how we reach young people, how we allow their voices to be shared in what we term build, learn, and connect. And I'm going to touch a little bit about each one of those strands at the moment. Build, for those of you who may have been familiar with our work in the past or seen it online, is a process of giving agency to young people to physically make spaces and places. And we do that at a range of scales, all the way through from desktop model making to pre-builds, which are large cardboard prototyping, to building actually making, or very directly plugging young people's ideas into real architecture built and designed by other architects. And I guess what's quite unique about our process is that youth voice, usually working with partners. So we until recently, we have been a commissioned organization. So cultural organizations, outreach organizations, education organizations, and increasingly local authorities, governments, developing consortia will choose to commission our services to work with communities. That's changing at the moment to also include our own programming. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the build process, or the build projects, or the build strand of work, is really unique in the sense that it, with our cultural collaborators, that allows the youth voice to be of dedicated communities and identified groups to be involved in the briefing, designing, building, and then ultimately use of spaces that are made by them. And historically, certainly in the first few years of our work, most of those builds, of which you see a few here, all built by young people between about 5 and 14 here, were typically commissioned by what we would call cultural collaborators, often museums, galleries, universities, school groups, who had existing powerful relationships with their local communities, and wanted and saw the power of what we were doing to make and shape things differently. So National Trust, that's the first project, new gateway and performance space, Whitechapel Gallery, a prototype for a new classroom, Phoenix School, the blue one, a shelter built in a school for children with autism, as a place of safety and reckoning in a transition between one campus and another, so a place of familiarity, and then Hull, a space for belonging. And again, the latter two I'll talk to a little bit more after I've gone through the main processes. So build is about direct agency of those young people, and pre-COVID we realized that we had achieved a lot and made a real difference to those people who we'd worked with and who'd experienced those spaces and places afterwards. But we wanted to find processes and ways in which we could reach more young people. And so we explored new strands and new ways of operating. And Learn is a way of extending reach beyond our team. And we do that through a number of ways, through what we would call train the trainer, skilling others to be able to deliver similar type programs, maybe not with the same sort of physicality of the builds, but engage young people with spatial kind of propositioning. Extended learning, so giving young people who we work with opportunity to think about careers in the built environment, and increasingly partnering, certainly in the UK, with practices that and organisations that are already involved in apprenticeship and extended training for people that want to offer marginalised communities who want to, or people from marginalised communities who want to explore careers within the built environment. And the train the trainer model, the big illustration on the left here is a project in Ireland, and we've done similar ones in Europe and Norway, where that model is spreading beyond the UK, and hope. Oh, it would be lovely to think there was one where we were working collaboratively with organisations in the US, and maybe there will be an opportunity to do a re-collaboration with Beam sometime in the near future. So Learn projects have a range of kind of partners, and here are a few. We often work with government organizations, universities, cultural organizations, and a way of demonstrating that would be a project here, which would be developing resources for the Mayor for London. In the UK, the London Mayor's Office has a design initiative for all schools and all young people, education organisations between 5 and 25, called Design Future London each year. And we write the resources to make sure that the design professionals delivering those do that in a way that's really meaningful for young people in an engaging way. And so that's a sort of below the line work, but that has massive influence. And for example, last year, 25,000 young Londoners were actively involved in projects to talk about and think about the shaping of their local areas through live active projects with architects and other design professionals. And that for us is testament to this idea of finding means of extending reach and really making a difference and sparking. I guess we're not always thinking about, or never been the mandate of training little architects or engineers or built environment professionals, but more of opening young people's minds to understanding how their environments are shaped, and in doing so, making them more empowered, better citizens who, in future, some of them may choose to get involved in built environments careers and professions, but actually others will just be more understanding of how they might be able to shape something if a planning application is happening or development is happening in their area. They will feel empowered to be able to have a say about that in a meaningful way. So Learn also reaches to outreach. We do a lot of widening participation in the UK, working with, in this case, universities in London to explore suburban perimeter communities on the perimeter of postcodes in London who are often from marginalised or ethnic communities who maybe have less exposure to opportunities in careers in the built environment. And we do that work always in an engaging way that's hopefully fun and hands-on and less sort of classroom based, and to allow people to see the opportunities of those careers. So Learn is about reach. Connect is I think is about influence and about bringing youth voice to the people and organizations who hold the keys to power in our societies, and in the UK, and I would imagine in North America too. That's government, local government, and probably most importantly, the landowners and development consortia who shape many of the places, and finances that shape many of the spaces and places certainly in our urban context. And our work in here, which is increasing sort of exponentially at the moment, is, I think, really important. And while on the surface it might appear less glamorous than the build, it's often, and we believe, is going to be the work that potentially changes cities and towns most profoundly by bringing youth voice to the table. And we do that by doing projects which have meaningful consultation engagement at a timely basis. Those of you listening who are architects or design professionals in the construction sector may have been involved in projects where consultation is done, but actually design decisions have been made, and at best it's information sharing, at worst it's process. So finding a way of bringing youth voice to the table. And what we find with bringing young people's voice to the table is that often and typically that is very outward looking and less egocentric, and is caring and is considerate and is focused on more sustainable cities, more sustainable places that are more equitable and more inviting of everyone, and care about inclusivity and accessibility. So, and sustainability, and they're really positive, and that they're really positive champions for better place. And the most profound and most inspired developers and local authorities in the UK are seeing the value of that. We do co-design, design where young people's voice is done in concert with design professionals, and embedding young people's ideas into the design team. And that might manifest itself as working, as I said, with developers in here. Someone like Grosvenor will talk of some of these projects in a second. Waltham Forest, local authority in the UK, local government, or directly with developers. So a project where a local park is being re-landscaped by a large landholder, understanding the value of that place to the young people that use it, in this case, reimagining the bench. The bench then goes on to be a prototype for something that permanently sited within that park, but also has an afterlife in a local school. Or working with a government authority to challenge, or to get young people to challenge emerging policy, and to do that in a way where policy ideas that are being explored prior to being published are tested through prototyping and making. Or very directly working with existing design teams to design small portions of buildings in the public realm, or public facing buildings. In this case, a new office building that's not publicly accessible, but was going to be a large frontage to the back of an urban kind of an urban square in London, and bringing young people's voices to shape and design that entire facade, or the tiles on that facade. And you see a picture of the original renders, early tile samples made by the young people, and the evolving design and prototypes that are being made at the moment in Italy. And increasingly working on multi-year projects with young people and seeing the value, of developers seeing the value, in this case, an extension to a city for 7,500 new homes in southern England. And in this context, setting up a forum of young people representative of their area, interested in shaping that future, maybe of a scheme that will take 20 to 25 years to complete, and many of whom will be the inhabitants of that place in the future, and taking their ideas and finding ways of, in this case, really inspired employer for us, who brought us on board even before the design teams were brought on board for the master planning and strategic work, to bring that voice to the table, to help shape the brief, and to think in this context about a much greener way of thinking about civic architecture. In this case, models of a civic square on the left, and prototyping for benches that are going to the public realm. Finding means of exhibiting work in a more engaging way that publicly makes that work more accessible than the conventions of online planning portals. So that's a reflection of these three strands: build, learn, and connect. But I thought I would take the next 10 minutes or so to reflect on the 2 or 3 key projects that in the office over the last 2 years, and talk a little bit more to those, and the experiences, our experiences, but experiences of the young people, and processes which led to their completion, to give a flavour and maybe contextualise some of the build projects for which I guess we're most known, and which is most unique. So the first one I'm going to talk to is called Made in Oakfield, and is a project which was presented to us, and the brief was to work with a community of young people excluded from mainstream school and in care. So some of the most institutionalized and marginalized members of a community in Northern England, who had been given an allotment space in the city, a shed You can see it here. And our job was to work with them to replace this shed and come up with something new. Now, this project was part of a city of culture, which had a lot of cultural events in the heart of that city, Hull, but had a real ambition from a cultural lead and education lead on that program, on that project, who wanted every young person, however marginalized, to have a direct experience of working with a cultural collaborator, a cultural practitioner, a creative practitioner. And in our case, we had this privilege of working with this group of young people, of 10 young people. And yeah, you can see this is day one, or when we first went up there. By all accounts, they weren't particularly interested in gardening or horticulture, but they had seen the value of this site as an escape from their institutional environment. And we worked with them over a period of 3 months, always with very tangible ways of making and talking about expressing ideas through model making and through ways that I guess equalize the opportunity for everyone to have a say. And often this really suits young people who have been maybe marginalized, who are struggling with more conventional academic courses. In this case, these young people had amazing ambition for this project beyond it as a place for a potting shed, actually as a place of respite and protection. And they also had an ambition of this building being much more kinetic, much more than just a shed. And as always with our projects, we work iteratively backwards and forwards over a series of workshops. So this was the first series of models that us drawing up in computer software, the first series of models that they had made in those workshops, and thinking about the configuration. That's always played backwards and forwards, and a process of refinement till we got to this point of this amazing green shed that somehow circumvented the bylaws that meant that we didn't need planning permission to make a building out of timber that had no foundations, but it was painted either green or brown. But in this case, wasn't a shed. It was quite a radical kind of proposition for a space away from their institutional lives. And the amazing thing about our build projects is they are tailored and designed so the young people we're working with, which will be different at ages for different projects, are tailored for them. So in this case, working with 14 and 15-year-olds, we're working with young adults or old children who are very able and skilled and have physical ability to do that. And all our projects are built in a week, and that's worth also pointing out. So those young people have opportunities to gain new skills and new training. And I'm not sure about in North America, but certainly my experience in the UK and Europe is that often young people, even in rural situations, have been less exposed to tool use and making than historically they would have been. So on day one, we're setting out the site with a couple of the team members, and then joined on day two by the crew of young people. And often, as you'll see on projects, often you'll see adults sort of standing by, and that's not because it's sort of superfluous. It's often because we want that agency to be really developed. All of the things you see, with the exception of working at height, can be done by young people, and they're encouraged to be led through those processes. And in this case, really incredible what was achieved by such a small group. And very quickly it becomes, as they gain their agency and understanding of the bigger picture and the processes, these projects become realizable at incredible speed. I guess sort of following traditions of people coming together to build, whether it's historic communities or maybe it's rural or religious communities in the States that come together to make and to build. And there are other examples perhaps all over the world. Well, there are other examples all over the world. When you have numbers, you're able to create amazing things quite quickly. And so by day three, we're sheathing and covering this building. We often will innovate. So a very small building here that's kinetic, but an unserviced building without power, but it's covered. It ultimately gets covered in a rubberized paint, which makes it waterproof and sealable very quickly. And here's my partner Fiona working with one of the young people, and it's often these experiences that go on to have lasting impacts and changes to those young people. Of the cohort that we are working with here, most weren't expected to graduate from from the equivalent, I guess, their high school or secondary school, we call it in the UK, with any qualifications. In this case, over half of them did, and used their direct experience working with us as a direct sort of stepping stone into the world of work. And this young man here now has a stable full-time job, having been excluded from mainstream school and being in care in a large manufacturing organization, making and leading a crew making wind turbines in the UK. So really positive stuff. And these projects are not only about young people, they're about the broader community. And so that group of young people were not best wanted maybe by that group of adults in their allotment initially, but this project became a bridging point for that group, in this case Compo. And so in a week we're able to build projects which transform hopefully lives, and we can take nice pictures like that, but the really special moments are when we go back and we see, you know, the nice handle that we'd given them taken off and this put on. I still think it's one of my favorite images. That's their new door handle to their space, and going with other people and allowing for us to introduce them to the young people, and for the young people to then show off this space and say about this. In this case, it's other people from another city of culture being introduced to that project. So hugely proud of those projects. And the next one, that's a small group of young people. As I said, I think 10 or 12 young people working with there. In this case, this is quite the opposite. It's working with 180 young people to conceive and make of a new space. And so at a completely different scale. So the first project is still there today, completed in 2018. And this next project, completed just before COVID, had a shorter life, but with much greater impact. One could argue in terms of numbers of people, impacts in different ways. So in this context, our client was someone called the Institute of Imagination, and they had an idea for a museum where you like an exploratorium where you could explore science, making, and imagination, and had some very particular ideas that they wanted to test out with young people. And we worked with over a series of days with many school children from local schools to explore the idea of how you would configure all the brief elements for this new sort of museum and exploratorium. And people often ask how we do that, how we bring many ideas into one without designing by committee and reaching sort of a muddy mediocrity. And we do that by finding ways of everyone's voice being very particular and individual at a project. In this case, the last two slides of young people thinking about the layout of a space, how it would be divided, and this girl telling Fiona or talking about the narrative of that space, or me here being told about actually how this floating structure above someone could create a sense of sort of intimacy below it, or telling stories about a space with a direct overlay of this large engine hall with stories about future possibilities. But that conversation about how we find possibility out of, let's say, 180 young people's ideas, we'll often do that by heat mapping. So we'll find commonality in ideas. So almost like design through crowdsourcing in a way, in a sort of quite old-fashioned kind of way, and seeing that. And what this map does here, you see a sort of a purple zone towards the center here. I think my cursor is showing, I'm not sure, hopefully. It showed this idea which completely threw the client's brief on the head, which was rather than a situational exhibition where you move from one place through to another, in this case actually it was a series of destinations sitting outside of this purple heart where you could move to different areas. You could move from the welcome area to the performance area out to the tool station and take something and cross-fertilize ideas. And over a period of time that gets mapped. We worked in terms of mapping that. I'm sort of skipping through a number of stages here, but mapping that across the piece. And we work with engineers to develop, details of construction. We prototype and we test. Often the processes that we're designing could be built in many ways, but we're, in this case, actually exploring the flex of applying, not to make a piece within the space, but to understand
whether that's going to be able to be built by an 8-year-old. And in this case, it was too flexible it wasn't flexible enough, and it was too much to do. So we had to develop the design to do that, and always within the process. In this case, working with older young people to explore the technical design of certain elements of that space. And our projects always begin with the core team, in this case, Aggie and Olivia. But they, as I've talked to them, they work with volunteers and people who want to contribute to those processes, either through giving from their organizations or through volunteering to supplement our core team. Young people, other people are contributing to those process, and we have a process of induction and training for that. Engineers checking our rope work and suspension. So prior to kids coming to a build, we spend a lot of time prepping that space so it becomes fully engaged for them. And we often use, for our temporary projects, we often use hanging structures because they create space very, very quickly. And the briefing on day one. So there's some prepping of some primary wood and cutting often on builds, but every piece of object that you see beyond chop sawing is worked through by young people. So all the made elements, every young person will have a direct response. And we cycle through about 40, 50 young people every day. We're working on part of the project, and then they all came together at the end. And this is the briefing for the volunteers. And so projects will start with a great deal of intensity and young people being skilled and training very literally on the job. We're very careful about people's safety and training, but they start off, but will often very quickly end with adults standing by while young people are doing projects and doing parts of those processes. So you see this is day one, and bits of this project will emerge, and a lot of energy goes into thinking about designing that experience. So during the making over that 5 or 7 day period, the young people, particularly in this case, 180 of them, as they're all cycling, they're all having a day experience of that, and they're all coming together at that final day, are all having very direct and meaningful experiences of making everything. And that takes a lot of coordination, coming through the days, all of these components pre-moving in. And then the finer things. So there's things for everyone, people who like more dexterous, fine motor activity to very kind of big kind of pieces of work. But everyone gets an opportunity to do everything, and those people who want to spend more time doing certain things have an opportunity to do that. So there's real agency. And this is an amazing space that we pre-fit out. And then over a period of 2 months, it was occupied and used by over 10,000 young Londoners. And this is when the space comes together and as a real incredible prototype for the museum. And we're so proud of that work and that project. This project, the last, I think, but one, is a project very briefly for a school for children with autism, which I touched on earlier on. And again, that idea of how one takes many ideas and comes to one. So this idea of proto building, the small maquettes in the front of this picture are built by knowing we're going to have a system, a process of working with these triangle rabbit ears, if you like, cuts of an 8x4 sheet of ply. Every young person was given the same numbers of pieces of wood in the small school and asked to explore how they would make a shelter. And then some of the more verbal students were able to join us for a day of what we'd call proto building. And this was the day of them sorting through and categorizing them in their eyes, not in our eyes, of how those spaces fell into shelters versus, I don't know, smaller enclosures versus marker points. And they started to shape those pieces into these elements, and ultimately over time and iteration that creates a bigger structure that they can physically build. And as I said, that space, which was very I guess very esoteric, very eccentric sort of structure, came very much directly out of their shaping, out of their work, and was a place of familiarity. So it went from their original built in their original school, moved by in parts to a temporary space, which is their temporary playground here in a building while their new school was being built. But always it was a sense of familiarity moving from one to the other. And a project taking it at a bigger scale, a project which is ongoing but in development, where young people's ideas are brought to this scale, a project with a museum in London,
it started during COVID, and processes we often use right at the start of projects now are these sort of mega drawings. So this project is for a youth play space for sort of teenagers in a gallery. So thinking about play in those sort of into teen years, where in this cultural organization where they will have an opportunity to just hang out, maybe rather the younger kids are playing. So we use this technique. Hopefully it's a really lovely one, where full-scale drawings are done on floors, exploring sort of spatial movement, spatial proposition, and then we spatialize those with card structures, and these drawings and structures can emerge in a matter of kind of 1 or 2 hours to be really useful kind of catalysts for thinking about that, enable young people to think spatially at scale and to take those up. And then this was like the following week, taking those ideas about proposition and then formalizing those in the actual space. So this is then taking half-scale card prototypes to the museum courtyard, and then working backwards and forwards through workshops through those dedicated group. In this case, we're working with about 20 or 30 young people about that space, and ultimately to create this space which is currently being fabricated. But very, very, very driven by their vision, and the, if you like, the brief of those things is the formal language of those are referencing elements within the gallery and within the museum that form parts of childhood play objects, but also referencing iconography within the built environment that they were referencing, and often, and in each structure, there are visual connections between the built environment reference point, if you like, the gleaned reference point, and the project which we're really proud of. And then finally, our most recently completed build, which started off before COVID, which was the designing of a new performance space for a theatre in London. And this opening image is on the first day of our meeting those young people and taking them to experience alternative architecture, in this case, a building within a building and a performance space in London. And again, using those prototype means of testing, often we'll find that people, and I'm sure it's the same in parts of North America, often communities and people working in cities and young people in cities will have not had direct experience outside of a small geography for all sorts of reasons. It can be financial, but it can also just be kind of culturally they don't feel they have agency in the wider city. So taking them out on an opportunity to see other architecture, expose them to different things is a really important part of that process. And that project was very sadly, this project was in March 2020, and this was we were prepping for our build, and then COVID happened. But amazingly, the client and us, our building was supposed to be a precursor to the theatre that's built. So while the theatre was being built, we were making a meanwhile structure outside built by young people to announce the arrival. By the time we were able to bring the project back to life, the theatre had been built, but we made then, a bit like our first site visit, a theatre within a theatre that became an active participatory space for 6 months. And working again in that collaborative way, this hoisting one of the main facades up, and again, everything you see here built by these 10-year-olds in London. And their first performance, having completed that structure, was a really lovely and powerful testament to that process, but also to the dedication, in that case, of the client. And that became a really lovely space that was then programmed not just for young people. There was a dedicated period where all the local schools could use and program that space differently, but it became a great pop-up space for comedy nights and for other live music, and it was really well received. So I'm going to cause a pause to that there. I hope that's been a useful insight into a little bit into our work, a little bit of history of where it came from, and a little bit about the process. Thank you, Danya, again for inviting me to talk, and I hope it's been a bit of inspiration. If you're interested in what we do, and you can see on the screen a bit of information there about us, do look out for us at www.mattandfiona.org, or follow us on Instagram. If you search Matt and Fiona, you'll find it easy enough, and that we'll keep you up to date to everything we're doing. Thanks a lot.